Chapter 1. About the author. Please don't skip this part. About the author sections usually come at the end of a book and share tidbits like, Chris Travis is the lead pastor of Everyday Church in New York City. A typical example would also include something personal, such as, he lives with his wife in Manhattan. If the author were in the mood to be cute, it might go on to say, he lives with his wife and 2 ungrateful cats in Manhattan. All of that is true. Chris Travis does live with his wife. His cats seldom express appreciation. They all live in Manhattan together. But of course, all of that isn't the whole truth. There are other true things about the author that are particularly relevant to this book. Things like, Chris knows what it feels like to be a failure, and Chris knows what it's like to have a classroom full of students throw things at him, and even at his best, Chris is often rebellious against God. Even though this is longer than the typical back of the book blurb, please don't skip this part. I want you to know why I've written this book before you read it. I want to tell you what happened during the 2 most significant years of my life. I want to share what happened during the worst year of my life, when God crushed me, pushed me to the point of cursing him, squeezed a lot of falsehood out of me, and changed how I see things. If I hadn't gone through what I did, I wouldn't truly believe what I do about significance. I wouldn't even know it to write it. Now I know it as well as I know anything. If I breathe, these things are true. If love exists, these things are true. I hope that by hearing some of what I went through, you'll understand why this stuff matters to you, and more to the point, why you matter. We need to understand why we matter as much as we need anything. We need it like we need food or air. Our souls don't growl for it the way our stomachs growl for food, or gasp for it the way our lungs gasp for air, but we hunger and gasp nonetheless in our own ways. Even the most satisfied among us regularly shush a certain longing. It rises up and takes hold, and there it is, a listless yearning for something more, and we must quiet it in order to go on with our lives in peace. Going to church, making a purchase, having fun, keeping busy, these things stuff a pacifier in its mouth, but not for long. The hungry maw named meaninglessness silently consumes one forgettable day after another. Is this life going anywhere? Will anything I do matter? Is there something more? Dashed against the nightmare reality. Don't think all black people are like this, the police officer said. He squeezed me in a rough bear hug. I could feel his bulletproof vest underneath his starched uniform shirt. It was like being hugged by a tree. He said these words to me, I think, because he was a black man. The principal of my school was black, and almost all the students and teachers were black. He said this to me because I was the only white person around, and I was the only one with a swollen eye. Imagine, I used to get nervous about preaching in a church. I used to actually feel anxious before standing in front of well-mannered church people who never throw things, never push you, never threaten to rape your wife. I didn't know what it was like to stand up in front of a crowd that openly hated me, gnashed their teeth at me, and said the foulest things you can think of to me. I didn't know how it would feel to see an entire class lunge out of their seats, energized by the simple sadistic joy of watching one kid punch another. And guess who stood between that classroom of students and the 2 who were fighting in the hallway? I did. But not for long. A whole classroom of 8th graders, some of them taller than I was, burst from the room like a shaken-up soda, and I was the bottle cap. I remember clearly the image of an 8th grader who was taller than me, jumping up and down, squealing with excitement to see the fight. In the chaos, someone slammed me against the wall, and I went home with a swollen eye. The police officers wanted me to press charges, but I couldn't be exactly sure who it was. And if there is one thing in Harlem worse than a white teacher who wants to make a difference, it's a white teacher who's a snitch. I wiped my tears, washed my face, and went back to class. That happened during my 2nd week on the job, but it wasn't the first time I had cried. The first time was after my very first day. I've never been one of those men who won't or can't cry. Men must either cry, kill, or get ulcers, and I usually choose to cry. But this was something new. I'm still not sure exactly what welled up in that moment. It surprised and frightened me. I had been up since well before the sun, taken the subway to Harlem, feverishly prepared my class, and told myself I could do this. And then they came. Usually, even the roughest kids will give you a few days. They call that the honeymoon period, and you've got to jump all over it to assert your authority and teach rules and procedures. But these kids came in looking for a fight. It was mayhem. They were out of their seats, at the windows, screaming, chasing each other, and throwing books. I couldn't get a word in without shouting. The moment I'd get a little control, a student would enter the class from the hallway and pick a fight with someone in my room, or they'd just throw a pencil into the class as they ran by. A student pushed me out of the way in order to get out of my class, and I was just glad he left. I tried shutting and locking the door to my classroom, but the temperature was in the 90s, and it became unbearable without the breeze. I dripped sweat all day. At around 8:30 that evening, I slumped back in my chair and watched the cursor blinking at the end of an unfinished lesson plan. Then I threw my head back and wailed like a baby. I'm not being figurative. I can't remember the last time I sobbed like that. I think it happened sometime before I started forming memories. There's a well-documented emotional trend first-year teachers in the inner city go through. Invariably, they fall from hopefulness into despair over the first few months, and then slowly climb back out. I think I fell in the first few hours, and the crash at the bottom almost broke me. In one moment, in one terrible, breakneck tumble from the dream of making a difference, I dashed against the nightmare of reality. That night I woke with a start at 3 a.m. from a terrifying dream about teaching and cried myself back to sleep. For months I got no rest. My dreams were troubled, and I'd wake up furious at the universe for denying me sanctuary, even in sleep. The most dangerous middle school in all of New York. I wasn't clueless. I was expecting it to be very difficult. I went to a rough public school myself, and I remember kids getting jumped, knife fights, and a race riot that made the news. I had worked with inner-city kids since then, too. I had tutored since I was in middle school and throughout college. Part of my training with the New York City Teaching Fellows included teaching at a summer school program at a difficult high school. So I thought I knew what I was getting into. I had changed careers intentionally from a staff position at a church where Lindsay and I were loved and supported. But no one could have predicted my school would be the lowest performing and most dangerous middle school in all of New York City that year. Out of nearly 1,500 schools and 1.1 million students in the largest public school system the world has ever known, I spent my first year teaching at the middle school with the highest rate of student injuries per capita. The School from Hell is the headline New York Post reporter Susan Edelman chose for her article about my school. She described it as a hellhole where teachers should get combat pay. They are cursed, assaulted, and sometimes groped. Kids hoot and yammer so loudly that their ruckus drowns out the teacher, Edelman wrote. A trash can is overturned in class and dumped. Grimy floors are littered with sunflower seed shells, spit out by the hundreds. Books and supplies fly out the windows. Edelman went on to explain how a gang of kids robbed a student every day for a month, how a female teacher discovered a sticky condom in her purse, how a teacher was transferred out of the school when a student threatened to rape his wife. This description was not an exaggeration. Students threw things at me, screamed obscenities in my face, stole things and ran out of the room, took their shoes off, stood on top of desks, touched girls, touched boys, and systematically went from one student to the next, disrupting education. One student like that makes it nearly impossible to teach. I had several such students in each class. There were 2 or 3 every period who seemed truly unable to control themselves. Visitors routinely asked whether my classes were for special ed students. They were not, but it certainly seemed to me that many were in need of services I was not qualified to provide. There was virtually no support for us. There was no phone in my classroom. It had been torn out and was never replaced in spite of requests submitted in writing. When I used my cell phone, I was reprimanded for it because we were technically not permitted to use cell phones in the classroom. If I managed to get a hold of someone to help, which was seldom, they might take the student out of the room if the student was willing to leave and talk to them. Then they would put them back in my class a few minutes later, at which point they would start right back up. Suspensions and expulsions came only after a lengthy legal proceeding. The discipline protocol was, in my opinion, a travesty and a grave injustice to poor and minority students. Students who finally did receive discipline often barely remembered what it was for. The rest of the students certainly had no idea why a particular student simply stopped coming to school one day, weeks after the offense. And even if they did remember, none of that mattered, because being suspended was a badge of honor. I was on my own, and I knew it. The slow death of my significance. The abuse from the students was horrible, and the resulting depression was the worst pain I've ever felt. It was far worse than any physical pain I've experienced. I would rather have one of my toes smashed with a hammer than go through it again. I remember mornings when, as I fried an egg for breakfast, the dread of the day would settle on me like some malevolent spirit, its heaviness so crippling I placed my hands on the sides of the stove and quietly wept. I cried more during that first year than I have in my entire adult life, times 10. The deepest pain, though, wasn't the abuse. It took me a long time to find the words to describe it. Eventually, I realized it was the slow death of my significance. I'd left a ministry position where I was highly regarded and where I regularly felt that my work was meaningful and effective. I've always been a hard worker and tend to excel by putting in the extra effort. I was valedictorian in high school with a 4.0 GPA, that kind of person. Being really good at what I do mattered more to me than I'd realized. At the end of my first year teaching, I received my evaluation report and discovered that I performed in the bottom 7th percentile of teachers. This report supposedly accounts for all the variables, my experience, what my school is like, etc. Academic experts are in the process of debunking the accuracy of these reports, but mine sent a pretty clear message. Out of every 100 teachers in my situation, 93 were more effective than I was. Trust me, I can rationalize with the best of them about why it really wasn't my fault. But it doesn't change the fact that I was completely ineffective. I was a teacher, and my students did not learn. I failed. I also rediscovered that I'm not such a good guy. I already knew that, but the words take on a textbook quality when you've been a pastor for a while and you have a lot of encouraging people around you all the time. You start to think, of course I'm not perfect, but I'm a decent sort of fellow. My experience teaching drew hatred out of my heart that I didn't know was there. From time to time, I would write a verse of scripture on an index card and carry it around with me, desperately clinging to anything that might help, hoping its promise or its encouragement would give me some strength. The other day I found one of those old cards in a drawer. On the front I had written Hebrews 12:11. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. Sometimes I would splash water on my face and stare in the mirror and tell the zombie looking back at me, peace and righteousness. It's worth it for peace and righteousness. On the back of that card, at some point, I angrily scrawled these words, I hate these kids. And the whole thing was so insignificant by any earthly standard. I was a middle school math teacher in a failing school. Nobody listened to me or cared about my opinions. All day long, students despised what I thought. My words were weak, and they didn't matter. Not at all like when I used to speak in church and people would dab their eyes or come up and thank me afterward for the encouragement. There was no power, money, or fame. There was something better. More on that later. It wasn't until pain. I don't know what you expect from a book like this. If you are interested in poverty or education, this book has something to say about it. I don't have any big ideas or answers, but poverty and education are the setting for much of this book, so it will naturally ask some questions and make some observations that may be helpful and should at least be interesting. If you are interested in spiritual things, in God or the Bible, this book has something to say about those too. You'll find that in spite of all the first-person narrative, God is in fact the protagonist. You can't miss him if you look. Those who seek, find. I've never experienced God working so powerfully through me as I did during my second year of teaching. But the real focus of this book is on significance. This is a book about what matters. I'd write 1,000 books to get this point across. In the surprising way God is changing the world, you matter. This book is an attempt to explain why. It was only after the 2 most difficult years of my life that I began to truly understand this simple truth about how much each of us matter. I'm sure I heard most of these concepts in seminary, but it wasn't until I went through what I did that I actually learned them. It wasn't until pain pumped blood into those words and brought them to their feet to march around my soul that I began to believe them. I'm a slow study and needed the discipline of personal experience. But I've written this book in faith that there's more than one way to learn something. I'm hoping that reading about my experiences will be enough for you to learn what I've learned. I never dreamed I might enjoy moments in my life like I did my second year of teaching, and I wouldn't trade them for any price. I really mean that. If you offered me $1 billion in exchange for one of these moments, I would despise the sum. Moments like these make your entire life worthwhile. I want you to have moments like that too. You may not even realize that your soul is growling for them, gasping for them, but go ahead and take a taste. Read. Inhale. About the author. About the author. Chris Travis failed. His mentor from Teachers College was embarrassed by his performance. Chris was mean to kids sometimes. A lot of kids really hated him. He worked hard, but he was found wanting. To his surprise, though, he discovered what matters, and has received a harvest of peace and righteousness he never dared wish for. If you would like to read what a humiliated, sinful failure has to say about what really matters, then I have just the book for you. We begin with a true paradox. The 2 years I spent teaching math in Harlem were the 2 most significant years of my life. They were also the most insignificant.